It's good to be back here on Sunday morning. We've had a great time in Ashland this past week. Kim and I and the girls, I can literally say we saw more of Ashland than we counted on. We were in downtown Ashland on Monday, and you remember the rainstorm? And I went out to move the car over because my parking 2-hour window was about up, so I moved the car up, and I shouldn't even be telling this story. I didn't plan on telling this, but now I'm stuck. So it has absolutely nothing to do with where we're going from here. But Kim and the girls were in a store, and I drove over by where they were, and the rain was coming down, and here came this fella, stark naked, not a stitch of clothes on, kind of not running. He should have been running. But not walking, he's kind of jogging and I guess taking a shower or something. I don't know. So we saw more of Ashland than we were anticipating. But we've had a great time and sure have appreciated your fellowship and all of your friendly support. Since this is just my second Sunday here, I confess it's difficult for me to know who's a regular, or who's an old-timer, who's a first-timer around here. I'll just tell you right now, if you're a first-timer, you need to come back to this church. I've been lots of places, and I've met lots of good folks in lots of great churches. But there's lots of friendly churches out there. But one thing that seems different about the Ashland Grace Point Church is this seems like a church where people really want to build friendships, not just be friendly. And if you're a newcomer around here, please don't bank it all on this sermon, okay? Come back again and get to know these folks, and especially get to know their pastor when he returns in 3 or 4 more weeks. When Kim and I moved to Kansas City and went to seminary, we were in seminary with Jim Curdy, the pastor here, and we visited a church, and we really loved this church. And the pastor had back surgery, so he was out for the pulpit for like several weeks. And but we really fell in love with this church, even though we had no idea who the pastor was. And by the time the pastor came back, Kim and I were saying, we hope we like this pastor as much as we like this church. And it turned out to be a great thing. But let me just tell you, this is a special place, and we're really grateful for the privilege of being with you. If you weren't here last week, I thought I might do a little bit of review, and yes, the title up there is correct. We are going to talk about the parable of the prodigal God today, but I thought before we get to that, we might do a little bit of refresher. If you were here last week, my students, believe it or not, come to my classes and they don't remember what I said the last class period, so I have that hard time believing that, but they tell me it's true. And I think that might be true here as well. So I thought I would start off with a little refresher for those of you who were here last week. And for those of you who weren't here, it might help shed a little light on where we're going to hopefully come in for a landing before the morning is done. Last week, I started a message that I called In Praise of Prodigal Living. And we were looking in Luke 15, in the New Testament Gospel of Luke, chapter 15. And we looked at the first 10 verses in Luke 15, and it started off with what we often call the parable of the lost sheep. And I said that really this is not, Luke 15 is not 3 parables like we often think. It's actually 1 parable. And so even though the heading in your Bible, the heading in my Bible says the parable of the lost sheep, verse 8, the parable of the lost coin, verse 11, the parable of the prodigal son. And but those are additions that publishers made along the way. Those weren't there when Luke wrote his gospel. This is really 1 parable in Luke 15, not 3. And last week when I kind of introduced this idea, I said I think a lot better way to think about Luke 15 is think about it as a 3-act play. And since we're in Ashland, Oregon, with the Oregon Shakespeare Festival right just a mile away or so away, I thought, well, maybe we should think of this as Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. So last week, we looked at Act 1, which was what we often call the parable of the lost sheep, which led to the question that, if we're going to talk about prodigal living. What is a prodigal? And so I kind of tossed that out to the congregation had some really good answers, and I'm going to see if we can get a refresher or two along the way here. So I'm going to put up, this is a slide from my favorite dictionary, American Heritage Dictionary, way better than Webster's Dictionary. And the definition of a prodigal, help me out. This is open screen, by the way, if you want to read it. But what is a prodigal? Does it mean a bad person? It means an extravagant person, a lavish person, a profuse in giving person. Now, those things can all end up, the wrong direction. My brother and me, when we would go on vacation with our folks, my folks would give us like $5 for, the whole summer vacation. It's when everything cost a penny, and my brother would sink it all in the gumball machine, and anything he could stick a coin in, the money just kind of ran through his fingers. And I would squirrel it all away and come home with $4.95 and have no fun on the trip. But my brother had a great time and had nothing to show for it. But he was lavish with the gumball machines. The money just kind of just flowed through his fingers. So prodigal doesn't necessarily mean bad. It can lead to bad consequences if you are too lavish, too extravagant, too profuse in giving in unhealthy ways, but it doesn't necessarily mean bad. The parable of the prodigal son does not mean the parable of the bad son, as I hope you'll see before we're done. So that was Act 1 we talked about last week. Act 2, we talked about the section, the next few verses, which is about, we call it often the parable of the lost coin. It's a story about a woman who has 10 silver coins. She loses one of them. She searches diligently through her home, and she finds it, and then she basically throws a party. And what was it last week that we discussed? What made this woman a prodigal? Lavish, extravagant, profuse in giving. Yes, sir? You're exactly right. And I liken this because there's all kinds of commentators out there who will say, well, a coin was worth, a day's wages or a week's wages. And so she had 10 of these and she lost one. It was valuable to her. So I just said, let's just call it a $100 bill. Search for a $100 bill. But then the implication here in Luke 15 that Jesus brings out in his parable is that basically, she loses a $100 bill and then she throws a $1,000 party to celebrate that she found the $100 bill. That's extravagant, that's lavish, that's profuse in giving. We'd all say, that's crazy, right? But that's part of the reason why I have a feeling Luke 15 is in the Bible. Because we wouldn't do it this way. We wouldn't leave 99 sheep in the wilderness to go find the one. We wouldn't risk it, most of us. That would be negligent. It sounds good. Jesus raises a good question. Which one of you, if this happened to you, would do it? We want to say we would, but when push comes to shove, would we really? So that was Act 1, talking about the parable of this lost sheep. Act 2, the parable of this lost coin. That's the way we put them in our Bibles. Now we're going to get, for the remainder of our time today, Act 3. The third part of one parable. And if you still don't believe me that this is one parable, take a look with me at Luke 15, verse 3. Luke puts it this way. So he, that is Jesus, told them these parables? Is that what it says? No. What does it say? This parable. One parable. So Jesus told them this parable. Act 1. Which one of you, if you had 100 sheep and lost one, would go search diligently for the one in the wilderness? Act 2. Which one of you would be like a woman who lost a valuable coin and searched diligently and found it and celebrated through this huge party to celebrate that you found this coin that you lost? Act 3 of the same parable. Pick up in verse 11. If you have your Bibles, I'd encourage you to follow along with me. Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons.
The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me."
In other words, he basically was saying, Dad, all things equal, drop dead. I'd like to cash in now on my inheritance.
Amazingly, he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had, and he traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. The money flowed between his fingers, just like my brother in the gumball machines. Verse 14, when he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went out and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. Verse 17, but when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off, and he went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate, and everyone lived happily ever after." But there's more, isn't there? Verse 25. Now the elder son was in the field. And when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on, and he replied, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he's got him back safe and sound." Then he became angry, and he refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, "Listen, for all these years, I've been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never even given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes home, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him." Then the father said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and has been found." This is one parable from verse 1 to verse 32. It's told in 3 parts, 3 acts, 3 vantage points. But it's one big parable. It has in this 3rd act, the one we're looking at for the balance of this chapter and for this final Sunday I'm here with you, it really has kind of 2 supporting characters and then one, what do they call that in the Academy Awards? The best actor character, whatever that would be. 2 supporting roles, one head role, one main actor. You might be surprised. Who's who, though? We call this the parable of the prodigal son. He gets the top billing. The bad kid, the ne'er-do-well kid, the one who makes the dumb mistakes, the one who's brash enough to say to his dad, Dad, you know, I'm really just not patient enough to wait for you to die. If everything's okay with you, I'd just like to get my money now and go. I mean, that's really what he was saying to his father. We think that he's the star of this act of the play, but he's not. He really doesn't deserve having this parable named after him, even though our Bibles may say so in the side notes. He's a supporting character. He's not really the main character on the stage. Now, when we think about everything we've talked about up to this point, what is a prodigal and so forth, we're inclined to see this younger man as the classic prodigal, right? In fact, that's how this term stays in our popular language. This is a pen and ink sketch that Rembrandt did several centuries ago. He was working up to this particular painting. This is also a Rembrandt painting. You had Survey of Art and Music probably at NAU. We learned a little bit about Rembrandt. Rembrandt likes lots of red and lots of dark, and unfortunately, there's all kinds of characters in here you can't see very well on this projector. So working up to this painting, Rembrandt worked on this little sketch. And this is a sketch of, guess who? The younger son, right? And here we see, what's this fella doing? He's on his knees. He doesn't look like a younger son. He kind of looks like an old man, right? But it's amazing what hard living can do to people pretty quick. If you don't believe me, go to a high school reunion sometime and take a look around. I mean, you know what I'm talking about? So here's this sketch of by Rembrandt of this younger son. And what is he doing? He's on his knees, and what's going on here? Help me out. He's in with a bunch of pigs, exactly. Now, so we got all these pigs that are eating, and here's this fella on his knees. I love the way Jesus tells stories. He sets up this story. He heads off to this far distant land. He squanders his wealth. And then what happens in the story? But lo and behold, a famine comes upon the land. Famines show up in the Bible, Old Testament and New, over and over again. And you find some amazing things happen when famine hits the land. And so in this case, we have the younger son, and he's in a distant country. He's far away from the land of his upbringing and the traditions of his elders. And now he's reduced to, of all things, a rich kid working by the sweat of his brow, a rich Jewish kid, I should say, working by the sweat of his brow, doing what? Feeding pigs. Jesus really knows how to turn the screws on his audience. Because remember last week when I said, who's Jesus talking to here? You back up verse 1. All the tax collectors and sinners had gathered round. Jesus was spending time with them. And then the Pharisees and the Jewish religious leaders, they're muttering to themselves and they're complaining that Jesus is spending time with these ne'er-do-well folks. So Jesus weaves in this little story about a boy now reduced to feeding pigs, which is, is there anything worse for a good Jewish kid to have to do? He's really kind of riling up these scribes and Pharisees. So here he is, he's begging for food. He would like the leftovers that the pigs aren't even interested in, but Jesus tells us here in Luke 15, nobody gives him anything. Zilch. So what is it that makes this young man a classic prodigal? This is your chance. This is open book, if you want to do it that way, friends. But what makes this guy a prodigal? He blows it all. Now, it's interesting that when Jesus tells the story about the younger son, and he's not all that specific about how we just know he blows his money. And you can kind of conjecture probably not the best investments that he made. But it's interesting later on in the story that the older brother has all kinds of ideas exactly how the younger brother spent the money. But Jesus doesn't supply us with any of that early on. But it's really clear. This guy lets the money just flow. Were you going to add something? Exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is about as low as a Jewish kid could get. So, does that give you some hope? You look at your own circumstances sometimes? But it really is true. I mean, he's blown it all. He's got nothing left. But it's interesting the way Jesus tells the story. He says, he came to his senses. Or he came to himself, some translators put it. He realized, wait a minute. I could be a hired man back on my dad's farm. I'm not going to be the son anymore, but if I could just work on the back 40 with those guys, I'd be way better off than where I'm at now. A year or so ago, we were flipping through the TV one night, and on PBS there was a program, maybe some of you saw it, about the Amish in Pennsylvania. And they're kind of featuring vignettes about Amish life in modern-day America. And they did this kind of scenario about this young man who left the Amish community. And that's, a really difficult thing, one for a person to do and a really difficult thing for the community to deal with. And so he was shunned from the community. They want him to come back, but they have these clear demarcations. And as I was watching that program, one of the people they were interviewing talked about how, can you imagine in the Amish community, in that household where the son left, every meal, breakfast, lunch, dinner, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, every day of the week, every week of the month, every month of the year, every single meal, the family sets a place at the table. And that kid knows every single day, off doing whatever it is he or she is doing, that there's a place at the table set for them. That's about as close as I can think in modern times of what this young prodigal experienced. He knew he could go home, but he didn't see himself back at the table. He just hoped he could somehow become a laborer in the field. The amazing thing about this younger son, because he gets a bum rap. I mean, he made some bad choices, but he came to himself, he comes back. But do you notice what he does when he comes back? Amazingly, again, Jesus amps up the story. Here's this wealthy, respected Jewish man, the father in the story, and he's kind of out on the back porch looking over the horizon, scanning, waiting, hoping, praying that his son will come home. And when he sees that dot on the horizon, it's the father, Jesus says, who runs to the son. It's the father who hikes up his robe and humbles himself and runs to his son and swallows him in an embrace. Now, that never happened in ancient times. In Near Eastern culture, wealthy, respected, especially people who had been treated badly like this father had, they would never run to a son who was disheveled and coming back. They would stand arms crossed and wait for them to come back and grovel and beg.
make them feel just how far they'd fallen. But not this father. This father runs to his son. God runs to us. God runs to you. And to his credit, this young man, when he experiences this lavish love of his father, he does follow up on his promise, doesn't he? He says, "Father, I'm not worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired." But he doesn't even seem to get the sentence all the way out, and all of a sudden the father is already interrupting it with commands to his servants to get the best robe and bring sandals and put a ring on his finger, and my son is back. And it's almost like the dad didn't even hear the son's confession. Pretty lavish, isn't it? Pretty extravagant. Maybe you're beginning to see who the real star of this parable is. It's not the younger son. It's the father. And if you don't believe me, turn back to verse 11 and see for yourself. Luke 15, verse 11. Jesus says, there was a younger son and an older son who had a father. Is that what it says? No. It says there was a man who had two sons. This is a parable about the father. Not about the younger son, not about the older son. This is a parable about a father. And friends, if you've had trouble in your life reconciling your life to God, what Jesus is trying to help us see in Luke 15 is that God defies our expectations. When we think that God is waiting in heaven to punish us and strike us, with a bolt of lightning the next time we mess up, Jesus is helping us see that God is extravagant. God is lavish. The God of our fathers is profuse with love, who runs to us before we can ever get there. God meets you and God meets me more than halfway, friends. As soon as we start to turn, we find God is already there. That's crazy. That's astonishing. That's lavish. It's prodigal. And that's God. But the story's not done. We pick up near the end of this chapter, verse 25. And we catch a glimpse of the older son. And he's another guy who you think, is going to be a hero, but he's not necessarily what you dream your oldest child is going to do. And this is a little bit of a zoom in of the previous picture from Rembrandt, and it shows these kind of faces here in the darkness. And most art historians believe that this fellow on the right is probably the older brother. He's the best dressed, and he doesn't look angry, but he's not overjoyed at seeing this younger brother come home. So I want to raise this question. What makes the older son a prodigal? Could it be that this older son is lavish or profuse in giving? It's hard to see him in that light, isn't it? It's hard because he seems to have the cart before the horse. Notice what he says to his father.
He's angry and he refuses to go in. And notice that the father comes out to him too. He refuses to go into the house, to the party, to the celebration. And so the same father now comes out to the older son and invites him in. It isn't just the younger son who gets the invitation. The father goes to the older son too. And he kind of gripes and whines and complains to his dad. Verse 29. Listen, for all these years, I've been working like a what? Slave for you. Can you imagine how the father must have felt? This is the kid who's got everything. He's been faithful. He's been on the ground. He's been working it. He's been, staying with it. But he's been doing it all for the exact wrong reason. He doesn't see himself as a son. He sees himself as a slave. He's just as messed up as his younger brother, but he never left home. But he's just as messed up. And like I said, he goes on and kind of fills in some of the blanks that Jesus doesn't supply for us earlier in this story about this younger brother. He says, but when this son of yours, notice he doesn't say this brother of mine, he says this son of yours comes home, and he adds in a little commentary, who has devoured your property with prostitutes. Never mentioned earlier in the story, but the older brother has a way of filling in the gaps. You throw a party for him. It's tough to see this older brother as a prodigal because there doesn't seem to be much that's lavish or excessive or profuse. It's interesting that Jesus doesn't end Luke 15 with, and they lived happily ever after. In fact, then Jesus just goes on and tells another parable, which leaves us all scratching our heads. At NNU, we evaluate all of our courses, and students, Emily knows all about this, and so students, they get tired of filling out all these things, but they evaluate every course and professor and so forth. And a couple of years ago, we put a new thing in place, and they were coming up with all these questions. And the academic dean at the university inserted a question into the survey for students to complete at the end of the course. And it was something like this. Rate the professor on whether the professor was Christ-like in his or her teaching. Now, there's nothing wrong with that question. But I thought about it for a bit, and I thought, now wait a second. If you look at the Gospels and you look at the way Jesus taught, how often did everybody walk away and say, by golly, I got it, it's perfect now, that makes perfect sense to me? No. It's the exact opposite. People are going, what are you talking about? Why do you keep talking about these crazy parables? I don't understand what you're saying. This doesn't make any sense. So it gives a lot of us hope, when our teaching is off. I'm just being Christ-like in the classroom. So, but but Jesus doesn't button it all up, does he? It just ends. But it ends with who's speaking? The Father. The invitation is there. A few years ago, when I was working on my dissertation, I ran across this book that was all about various artistic renditions of Luke 15. And I ran across in this book, let's see if I can put it up here on the screen. I got way off my notes, so I'm going to just scroll through some of this. Okay, I got to a series of images from a contemporary photographer. And, but it was alluding to Luke 15. And this is a series of photographs. And this is one of the series. And I had to be really, I'll be completely honest with you, I had to be careful about which images I put up here because I wasn't quite sure that they might be appropriate for everybody in an audience. So this is one of the images in the series, and this fellow over here on the left-hand side of the screen, when the series of images starts, he's kind of sitting with his back to the center. He's kind of facing that direction over to the left, and he's reading a newspaper, and he's kind of oblivious, and this much younger man comes in, all disheveled, and kind of like our friend in downtown Ashland earlier this week, stark naked. It's kind of a jarring image. And then in the next image, the man moves into the center from the right-hand side of the screen into the middle, his head bowed and his shoulders slumped. And the man on the left turns, and in the third image kind of drops the newspaper and begins to stand up. And all the while, this other younger man, completely vulnerable, completely without any protection, just naked. And then the image that progresses beyond this shows the older man unbuttoning his shirt. And in the next image, you see the younger man wearing the older man's shirt. And then in the next image, you see the older man taking off his trousers. Until finally, in the last image, which is, I think, probably too graphic for most churches to show, you see this older man, now stark naked, embracing a fully clothed young man. Now, I don't pretend that the photographer who put this series of images together is necessarily a Christian, but he taught me a very powerful lesson with these slides. It was a lesson that didn't come when I saw them the first time. It came probably a year or two later after coming across them multiple times in this book. Because I saw this as the parable of the prodigal son, and I saw it and I thought, well, there's so many places where these images disconnect with Luke 15, 11 through 32. Because the father in the story, he's not indifferent, reading the newspaper, looking out the window. He's scanning the horizon, wringing his hands, praying, hoping his son comes back sometime soon. And when the man comes in naked and disheveled, he doesn't kind of stand at arm's length. He calls for the best robe to come, for sandals to be put on his feet. It didn't make any sense to me. There's too many points of disconnect. And then one day, the Spirit seemed to speak to me to say, maybe this is Luke 15, verse 33 and following. Maybe this artist is trying to help us see the reconciliation that we don't find in Luke 15. Maybe this is the reconciliation that we hope and pray for. For an older brother who really does finally become like his dad. He's no longer a servant, no longer a slave, but he has it all. And he's learned from his dad to give everything. And for a younger son who recognizes that in the Father's house, he could never be a slave. He's always a son. He's been lost, but he's found again. I don't know where you're at in Luke 15. I know some of you have shared with me over the last week that you can identify with being a lost sheep. I know that some of you have seen in some new ways what it means to celebrate finding a $100 bill and throwing a $1,000 party. Perhaps today you've always thought of yourself as that prodigal son. You came home, but you still kind of see yourself as a second-class citizen. You wish that you hadn't done whatever it was that you did, and you're back. But you're a second-class citizen. Hear the words of the gospel today. Quick, put a robe on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Let's celebrate. This son of mine was dead and is alive again. You see, as extravagant as the shepherd was to risk 99 sheep in the wilderness to go find one, as profuse as the woman was to throw a $100 or $1,000 party for a found $100 bill, for as extravagant as the young son could be in coming back to his senses and coming back home to his father. And hopefully, in the unwritten part of Luke 15, an older son who chooses to grow up and become like his dad. All of those, every last one of them, pales in comparison to the star of this parable, the Father. This is the parable of a reckless, extravagant, lavish, profuse father. The kind of father who would have a son like